to be respectful of everybody's time, we wanted to kind of move briskly. And one of the agenda items that we put right at the top today is related to our industry's economic impact study, which is done every 3 years and has turned out to be a really great way to get a snapshot of our industry's employment, its tax base, the components of our economics in jobs and taxes and revenues by county and by state and by sector. It's a pretty exhaustive exercise, as you'd guess. It requires trained experts who are skilled and talented in modeling and in aggregating all the strands of information that this kind of study requires. It started out as something that was helpful to make our case to legislators and lawmakers and policymakers. It has since expanded in its utility, such that there are winemakers all over the state and growers who are using the data from this, which, as I said, is available on a county by county level whenever they have a county zoning or a land use or a question about an asphalt batch plant siting or anything, solar siting, anything related to our industry. These data are helpful. So we have Robert Eyler and Chris Miller, who are our longtime partners in this study and are our partners again. And I'll let Robert and Chris talk about the study generally if they'd like, but since we're fairly tight for time, I will ask them to get, just as soon as they're ready, into questions that have popped up specifically, as they do periodically, and they're good questions about wanting to make sure that the data a winery or a grower would provide to Chris and to Robert, it doesn't go to the Oregon Wine Board. The data goes to the researchers, how that data is protected. So let me introduce Robert Eyler and Chris Miller, our research partners in our economic impact study. But first, let me see if Jess Willey has any additional commentary to add to that I may have missed.
Thanks, Tom. That was a pretty thorough introduction. I just wanted to reiterate the thanks to Christian and Rob for joining us. I'm sure that Christian goes without or needs no introduction to this group. He's a fixture of the wine industry, having and you probably have seen him either at a symposium or a wine market council presentation or presenting on research that we've commissioned through his own full glass research. Christian's led this study for us for many years. He's worked with Rob in the background of this study, and this year Rob is leading the study. Rob is a professor of economics at Sonoma State University and also runs his own macroeconomics research consultancy and has broad sector experience in economic modeling. So we're feeling like this is in really good hands. I've asked Rob and Christian today to speak specifically to the importance of the survey, the questionnaire that's gone out to the industry and how that feeds into their work, the efforts that they've made to significantly streamline the work, the survey this year, and also, as Tom mentioned, the confidentiality of the data. And if it's okay with Christian and Rob, because we're recording this meeting, I'd like to take a snippet of what you are about to say and share it in my next email to the industry about taking the plea to take the questionnaire. So
no problem here.
Great. So yeah, take it away. Take it away.
Yeah, I'd like to do just a quick introduction because you've been seeing sort of me as the front face of this project for a long, for the last 4 versions, I believe. But Rob, as Jess alluded to, Rob has been doing a lot of the sort of the economic modeling based stuff, which includes some of the indirect and all of the induced impact. In other words, basically the ripple effects. Rob is absolutely, however, not a newcomer to this kind of analysis. He does it for a variety of industry sectors, across multiple states, including the wine industry. And he and I have, traded ideas and things about the wine industry for many years now. The reason we flip-flopped our roles somewhat this year is because I just did not have the bandwidth when this project was starting out, and I knew there was some there were also going to be additional complexities due to the, what we've discussed about 2019, 2020 and the COVID impact and so on. So I really thought, I called up Rob and said, will you be interested in sort of taking the lead on this, because some of those complexities he's frankly better suited to address than me. And as I said, I didn't quite have the bandwidth. So I'm going to be kibitzing and glancing over his shoulder and helping with just the winery and distribution models. And Rob's going to be taking the front line as well as doing all the stuff he's always done. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Christian. And thanks, folks, for having me today. And great to meet you, even though it's virtual, unfortunately. So in terms of the questions that Jess wanted us to address, the importance of the survey is to really provide some color and some additional corroboration of what we're going to see in the aggregate numbers otherwise. So there's other surveys and census out there that help provide the data set that we need to show this ripple effect from the vineyard all the way to the glass, if you will. And part of that in the survey piece is really just saying, okay, are there any anomalies, or are there other things we got to think about in terms of the final modeling of the effects of the Oregon wine industry on the Oregon economy? And when we do that, it's really to sort of set the stage for doing the indirect and the induced impacts. So one of the critical factors in doing a report like this is getting really strong data about the industry as what you could think of as the direct impact. So the visual I use is, think of a still pond of water and a rock that's thrown into the middle of the pond, and then the waves roll out from the rock. The rock is the Oregon wine industry. The ripple is how the rest of the Oregon economy is affected by it. And so if you don't have a very good rock when it hits the water, you won't measure the ripple effects very well either. So what the survey really does is solidify that rock for us in terms of the primary data sources we need to do the job right and precisely. In terms of the survey this year, it definitely has been streamlined and stripped down to really the basic things we need. And the idea is that you guys have already done other census and surveys in the past. It's just really sort of, again, to corroborate what we may get out of other surveys, but also to just add a little bit more color to the overall data package that we're going to use to ultimately shape the inputs into the economic impact model. So we hope that the questions that you have in front of you when you see the survey are fewer and less difficult to look up and find the answers to. And so far, we've actually got a pretty good response, I think. We've got 43 responses as of this morning, which I think is about in line with Christian's history with respect to the industry survey. And then
speed-wise, that's faster. And those of you who do perhaps unfortunately remember the last couple of surveys will appreciate just how streamlined Rob has made this. It's just one, instead of one for the marketing and one for accounting, it's one streamlined survey. And the number of questions has been tremendously reduced, especially those, have to look up kind of cost questions. Oh, I also wanted to add one other thing about that's very useful about the survey that only the survey can do, and that is it plugs in some important numbers into the winery sales and distribution system sales models. And those help really highlight the impact of Oregon vineyards and wineries specifically in the Oregon economy downstream from the actual producers. And my favorite chart in the last presentation I did on the last one was really this table, which showed that even though Oregon wineries are much smaller and they are a minority of total sales of all wine in Oregon, their impact on employment and indirect impacts is far, far above that. In fact, in some cases, the majority of the impact. So,
absolutely. Thank you, Christian. And that's why we do the surveys. It really adds flavor and depth to the data that we use to do the final modeling. And then finally, in terms of the confidentiality, folks, I'm sorry, being anonymous is a big deal in survey work. So the data stay with Christian and I only. They don't go anywhere else. We may reach out and contact you if there's some discrepancy in the numbers or something that we think was transposed and we just want to be absolutely clear. But otherwise, we're going to take the numbers, scrub them of any identifiers, and will only be reported in the aggregate where not any one respondent's figures will be discernible from the final product. And Christian and I hold on to those for 100% of the time and do not share them with anybody. So in principle, that's the overview based on Jess's questions. I don't know if there's other questions or we have time, but I'm hoping that if you've seen past studies, you know the basic idea. Hopefully the visual I talked about and Christian's additional comments about the use of the downstream model kind of give you a full sense of where we're going with the data once we have them all and we put together the report.
Thank you, Rob and Christian. Are there questions from participants in today's call?
Tom, I would have two questions. One is, how would non-participation in or non-response to the survey, how would that hurt the industry as a whole?
Well, the first one that pops to my mind is if we got an imbalance of those responses, like for instance, no one from Rogue River Valley, or no one from Columbia Gorge, or no one from the really very small, sort of under 5,000 case community or something like that, because that would kind of tilt the results, in one direction or another. Rob, you can cover other possible impacts that.
Well, just like any other, if you're basing the entire study on survey work, then you are somewhat at risk. What this is really doing for us is corroborating other data and providing a more complete breadth of what's going on across Oregon as we need it. So to Christian's point, if we're missing specific larger areas, that's a problem. What the smaller areas can do is make sure that we're covering it and we're getting some toehold on maybe some of the nuances in that area versus other parts of Oregon. But that's what the survey work should do in the end is really provide width rather than breadth, especially in a case where you have smaller communities that have some touch on the wine industry and that we might not find as much primary information about that part of Oregon as others.
As you might imagine, I'm not trying to not fill out the survey, but more importantly, find what Jess, Tom, and the wine board can be telling the industry that the industry will be missing if a specific winery or specific vineyard does not respond. So I think what you said was helpful. Do you have any further help for the staff in that way?
Sure. I think one of the other things you can do is say, look, because we're looking at this at the county level, if we have wineries or vineyards that are in specific counties who need data to utilize locally, and they can break out that portion of the report, if they don't respond to us and we don't have some of the nuances that might be happening locally in smaller counties, that's really where the power of the survey instrument comes in, is that it allows you to tell us things that we would not know maybe. In other words, if there's something extra there, we can put that in the modeling such that it actually gives more specificity to the one county situation that we might not have otherwise. And then when using the report, that person can utilize that with their local supervisors or local political entities and say, look, here's something out of this report that's very specific to our area, and this is why you need to listen. So if we don't have that data, it's one
about 3 o'clock last night or sooner.
I'm sorry?
What do you mean?
Oh, so anyway, does that help?
Yeah, I think that's good. That county commissions would have the ability to source fiscal data that they wouldn't otherwise have about the wine industry. And if a county is growing rapidly, they may not know it if the data isn't updated every. If an industry is just starting out and is becoming important, this would recognize it. And even in a place like Yamhill County, which is quite mature, having current data about the size of the industry would be important. Are there statewide issues that underreporting would have a physical impact on the industry?
I would say that possibly, I'm just speaking for the distribution model, if you are in a sector that's underrepresented and has some unique aspect to it, like, the sort of 2,500 to 5,000 case wineries, and few or no people report on that, it's going to impact it in the distribution model, in terms of like, well, what channels are you really supporting and having an impact on in the Oregon economy? And subsequently, as Rob pointed out, the ripple effect from each of those channels would be underestimated. So that's one area I can think of. And then I'd also say, just as Rob said with counties, so it is with regions. If no one from Milton Freewater or Umpqua Valley respond, they're going to be, it's going to have some impact on the details of how important those wineries in those particular areas are.
Yeah, and that's why the importance of the survey is making sure that we have our details right, but furthermore that it gives a little bit more geographic focus as needed, because there are going to be some potential holes in the data by geography for smaller areas.
Could I ask maybe the researchers to comment on one thing? This is Tom again. Appreciate your comments. I appreciate your comments, Rob and Chris, and I know you've done the work with Jess Willey at the Wine Board to streamline and tighten up the actual questionnaire. But at the same time, you've been responsive to our desire to get at least some insights into how the COVID pandemic is affecting our business. Could you spend just a quick second on the research approach? Quick second. I know it's a multi-part discussion.
That's okay. So
yeah, just because that makes this unique, and it's especially relevant to getting our response rates up, because it's a common question of what's happening in our business because of COVID.
Absolutely. So the idea is that the 2019 data acts as a benchmark, and our questions about what's been happening in 2020 would then help us look at what the effect of COVID has been. So one of the things that Jess, Christian, and I talked about at length was, at some point we have to think about how do we discern what might be natural market forces against what's happened with COVID, and how do you, in a sense, decompose those two from each other. What the survey data can do is it can help us try to figure that out against what we're seeing in the aggregate. In other words, we're seeing trends moving one way that seem very COVID related, but there are things happening in the survey data that might make us scratch our head a little bit. Then it might also allow us to really decouple what might be slow moving market forces against the real sharp shock that's happened with COVID-19. So but the key is the two-part piece. The survey helps us get a toehold on what's happened so far in 2020, that the aggregate data will not be published until a later date. And the 2019 part, which is the core part, provides a benchmark against those to provide some inkling of an analysis. And then it goes back to what I said before. You use the two together when you go in front of political bodies and say, look, here's how important we are, here's what's happened to us, and this is why we need your support for both reasons. We're also not only important, but an important part of your local economy has been hurt by this, and to provide more regulation or to not ease other pieces of what we do in terms of the cost of doing business. These are the potential impacts that are going to be, this is how you're going to exacerbate what's already happening to us because of COVID-19. So that's, in essence, that's how the two will tie to each other, and that's why we're asking both simultaneously.
That's great. Thank you, Rob.
Of course.
Other comments? Go ahead.
I had one other question that was unrelated to the first. In the past surveys, I think it's fair to say that there has been a mixture of wine industry data that includes distribution and other pieces with the wine industry as it might be purely interpreted. And Robert, you hit on some of that about 10 minutes ago in your comments, but I wanted to ask, is it going to be clearer in the report that comes out this year what is the actual contribution of the wine industry of Oregon wine and the trickle-down effect on the economy, as opposed to the effect of all wine on the trickle down effect.
So Christian may have a little bit more specificity on that, but my memory is from past reports that that's a key issue in sort of decoupling what, let's say that there was no Oregon wine at all, and it was all imported wine, so to speak. That would have a much different effect than the mix of the two together. And it is good to think about the two as distinct from each other. But Christian, maybe you can talk a little bit about how the model you normally focus on does that.
Yeah, I mean, we've always, in the past several versions, there's been an appendix specifically devoted to that isolates the Oregon component. And the last time we presented it at the symposium, that was also a specific slide. I can't think of any reason why we wouldn't be able to run that this year just as well. So, and just as clearly. And as David alluded to, it is you guys punch way above your weight in terms of economic impact. If you were to just look at cases and even revenues in the Oregon state economy, you'd say, well, they're significant but not, critical. But then when you look at, actual employment, because of so many supporting industries and supplier industries and so on, and this is one of the great things about the wine industry is that it's, compared to like the Apple industry or something, it's just the ripple effect is much bigger on the supplier end. So that's where that comes from. And I don't see any reason why we wouldn't have a similar appendix for 2019.
Agreed.
Here. I actually see in chat, Morgan has a question, which was what has worked in the past to get wineries and vineyards to complete the survey, i.e. phone calls, etc. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we do have the survey per se, is partly also so we can call people up and ask them can you can you fill in this, because we can see that there's an imbalance. I remember last time there was a Southern Oregon was a bit slow in filling in the surveys, and so I called up a few people, and we actually, contrary to expectations, we actually had an underrepresentation of some of the bigger wineries, so I had to call them up individually. I think regional organizations promoting it would be helpful in the sense that then it's not always the Oregon Wine Board email that comes in reminding people, or the call. It's sort of coming from multiple angles, and my belief that at least in marketing, that certainly increases, awareness. So I'm going to guess it would be the same here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we probably need to move on, but all those points are absolutely right on. Let's just quickly recap what we're done here. When you hear us talk about the economic impact study and the purpose of this is the data source that you might hear us or see quoted in the newspapers. It's the basis for our assertion that our industry has very nearly a $6 billion footprint economically in the state. It's the basis for where we get the fact that 29,000 jobs in total are attributable to our industry. And wine tourism specifically is a $787 million a year business. It's where we get those numbers. It's where it's in addition to being useful when we talk to lawmakers, they are becoming increasingly helpful, especially at the county level, when we go to either ODA or Travel Oregon or any one of the other grant awarding institution partners that we have. And with the importance of fundraising and grant income now, having accurate data on the industry is critical. You heard Robert and Christian talk, and thank you for your questions, David. You heard Robert and Christian talk about a shortened, more streamlined survey. You also heard the reason why we're talking about it right now. Regional associations are critical to this. If you're sitting there individually saying, well, I did my part, I filled out my part, thank you. That is a huge help. It's equally helpful to bring this topic up in your regional meetings, whether it's grower or winery groups. That top spin helps us get to people who might just be missing or have Oregon Wine Board messages accidentally go into their spam filter, in their spam folder. So regional assistance is hugely helpful, as is individual assistance. Is there anything else we should touch on, Rob or Christian? I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you short. I want to give you every chance to say everything that you want our folks to hear.
No, I mean, I think if that gives you all an overview and the ideas about the importance of doing the survey, that's really the critical thing. And do not have any consternation whatsoever about the confidentiality. Christian and I are the only two who are going to see the data in specific and will not be published in any way that can point out any one winery whatsoever. So or vineyard, do not worry about that at all.
I see one question now from Mike McNally. Does the survey provides good detailed information on the samples? How do you estimate the universe? Wine production and wine production and wine sales and some of the things like variety or yields, etc., come from the the Oregon Vineyard and Winery Census that the university runs as the basis, and then the 2020. We've been talking about various ways to gather, as Rob alluded to earlier, change related data to apply to the 2019, base that we will have constructed. And there are other sources, the OASS for, production of other fruits for comparison, things like that. So.
That's a really excellent point. The question brings up, Chris, is the sort of interdependent nature of the Vineyard and Winery Survey done annually by the University of Oregon, and you've heard us talk about that earlier in the year, and counterweighted by this 3-year economic impact study, which takes much of its data from the first. They fit together hopefully well, but they're both really, really important. It's not uncommon sometimes to get a call at the wine board and somebody will say, hey, do we have this particular piece of data? And we can sometimes get close to it using one of the 2 surveys I just talked about. And sometimes I'll ask, well, did you provide your data? Did you fill that out? And sometimes I'll get back, well, we're pretty small. Our data couldn't matter. Yet here is the person saying they didn't fill it out. Their survey responses don't matter. Yet they're really interested in the report from a survey that they didn't fill out. Everybody's data is really, really helpful. In aggregate, all of our 800 wineries and 1,200 growers have the best information for these things. So there's just no other way. So we really value your help as well as the regions. Chris and Rob, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, wait, I actually have one coda that came up, Jess brought up, and I forgot to cover it earlier. And that is, some people, you may get, you folks who are sort of promoting this survey, you may get questions back like, wait, didn't I answer this question before or already for the Vineyard and Winery? And there are a few, they're not many, but there are a few questions like that. And the reason those are in there is so we can essentially cross tab with the other unique data questions which makes a big difference for the various models that we use.
Good point. Thank you for clarifying.
Thanks, Christian.